The ship dropped out of hyperspace at 04:17 Galactic Standard Time, and Ensign Mira Solis was the only person on the bridge who saw it happen. She was stationed at the rear sensor console of the CRS Vigilant, a Confederate patrol corvette assigned to the Termagant Run, a desolate stretch of border space between the Confederation and the unclaimed territories beyond. The Vigilant's crew of 42 rotated through 4 watches, and Myra had drawn the graveyard shift, the 4 hours between midnight and dawn station time when nothing ever happened, and the bridge was staffed by the least senior officers and the most expendable ensigns. The Hyperspace Detection Array was an automated system. It monitored a fixed volume of local space for the gravitational distortions that indicated a vessel transitioning between normal space and the hyperspace corridor network that the Confederation used for faster-than-light travel. The system was reliable but boring, and on the graveyard shift it was mostly ignored. The display showed a flat line representing the background noise of local space, and it had shown a flat line for every one of the 412 graveyard shifts that Myra had pulled since being assigned to the Vigilant 8 months ago. The line jumped, a single spike sharp and clean that appeared and disappeared in less than a second. The automated system flagged it as a probable sensor glitch and began the standard verification cycle that would take 90 seconds to complete and would almost certainly return a false positive result. Myra did not wait for the verification. She had been staring at the flat line for 8 months, and the spike had the quality of something real, a precision and abruptness that sensor glitches rarely possessed. She manually overridden the automated verification and initiated a full-spectrum scan of the volume of space where the spike had appeared. The scan took 4 seconds. It returned a contact. The contact was large, very large. Mass estimate approximately 3.2 million metric tons, which placed it in the range of a capital ship, a battleship or carrier. The kind of vessel that only the largest member species of the Confederation could build, and that never operated in the Termagant Run because there was nothing in the Termagant Run worth sending a capital ship to protect. The contact was stationary, having emerged from hyperspace and then immediately stopped, as if the transition had been the last act of a journey that had left the vessel with no further momentum to spend. Myra's hands moved across her console with a speed that surprised her, pulling navigational data, running identification protocols, requesting a visual feed from the external cameras. The contact was 300 kilometers from the Vigilant, close enough that the external cameras could resolve it as something more than a point of light, and when the image appeared on her display, Myra's hands stopped moving and her breath caught in her throat. It was a warship. The hull was a dark gray-green color that the cameras rendered with imperfect fidelity, but the shape was unmistakable. A long, angular hull with a raised superstructure near the stern and weapon mounts that covered the dorsal and ventral ridges in a density that was almost excessive. The ship was damaged. Large sections of the hull were missing, revealing internal decks that were dark and open to space. The forward section bore the scars of impacts that had torn through multiple layers of armor, and the engine block at the stern was a ragged ruin of shattered housing and exposed machinery. But the proportions were human. The placement of the superstructure, the configuration of the weapon mounts, the relationship between the major hull sections, all of it spoke with a design vocabulary that Myra recognized from her training in naval architecture at the Academy. This was a human warship, built by human engineers to human specifications. And it was old. The hull's surface texture was wrong for any modern human vessel, and the weapon mounts were of a type that Myra had only seen in historical archives, energy projector arrays that had been obsolete for thousands of years. The design language was consistent with human military architecture from the pre-consolidation era, roughly 15 to 20,000 years before the present, a period that was poorly documented and poorly understood because the civilizations of that era had destroyed themselves before the consolidation. Myra hit the bridge alert. The alarm brought the officer of the watch, Lieutenant Commander Jorath, a Torsen with the massive build and slow deliberation of his species, onto the bridge in 90 seconds. He looked at the contact on the main display and then looked at Myra with an expression that, on a Torsen face, registered as controlled alarm. Report. Unidentified contact bearing 172 Mark IV, range 300 kilometers. MAS. Estimate 3.2 million metric tons, consistent with a capital-class vessel. Hull configuration is consistent with human preconsolidation military architecture. The contact is stationary and appears to be heavily damaged. No active power signatures detected. No electromagnetic emissions. No communication signals. Jorath stared at the display. Preconsolidation, that would make it roughly 17,000 years old based on the design correlation. The confidence level is 63%, which is high enough to be significant. A 63% is not 100%. No, sir, but nothing else in the known databases matches this configuration. And the human preconsolidation correlation is the only one that matches at all. Jorath was quiet for 10 seconds, a long time for a Torsen whose species valued decisive action over contemplation. Then he turned to the communications station. Contact the captain, wake him if necessary, and get me a line to Sector Command, Priority 1. The captain, a human named Ada Okonkwo, arrived on the bridge in 4 minutes, dressed in the rumpled uniform of someone who had been asleep and was not happy about being woken. She looked at the main display, and the look on her face went from irritation to attention to something that Myra could only describe as recognition, as if the captain were seeing something that she had expected, in some abstract way, to eventually see. Ensign Solis, Okonkwo said, "You're the one who spotted it." "Oh yes, ma'am." "Good work," Okonkwo turned to Jorath. "Get us to 500 meters, slow approach, full sensor coverage. I want to know everything about that ship before we get close enough to touch it." The Vigilant moved toward the Derelict at a cautious quarter impulse, its sensors painting the ancient vessel with every frequency and modality they possessed. As the distance closed, the details resolved with a clarity that made the initial assessment more certain and more disturbing. The ship was human without meaningful doubt. The hull configuration, while unlike any specific class in the current or historical databases, was built on human design principles that were unmistakable. The weapon mounts were a type that existed only in the preconsolidation era, energy projectors that had been replaced by more efficient weapons long before the Confederation was founded. And the damage was consistent with combat, not with the gradual degradation of age. This ship had been in a battle, a serious one, and it had lost. No active power, the sensor officer reported. No biological life signs, no thermal signatures above ambient background. The hull temperature is consistent with the local radiation temperature of deep space, which suggests the ship has been without power for a very long time. "How long?" Okonkwo asked. "Based on the radioactive cooling curve of the hull material, assuming an initial temperature consistent with an operational vessel and a constant ambient radiation environment, the estimated time since power loss is approximately 16 to 18,000 years." Okonkwo nodded slowly. She was not surprised. Myra could see that. The captain had recognized something in the Derelict's image that went beyond the technical assessment, a quality of familiarity that suggested prior knowledge or expectation. "Captain," Myra said, and then stopped, because she was an ensign on the graveyard shift and she was about to ask a question that was above her station. "Oh, speak, ensign." The ship emerged from hyperspace. The detection array registered a hyperspace transition signature, but the ship has no active power. How can a ship with no power make a hyperspace jump? The bridge was quiet. It was a good question, and it was a question that no one had an immediate answer for. Hyperspace transitions required enormous energy, far more than a ship's conventional systems could store. The energy was drawn from the hyperspace corridor itself during the transition, but initiating the transition required a significant power expenditure that had to come from the ship's internal systems. A ship with no power could not initiate a transition. Perhaps the jump was initiated before the ship lost power, Jorath suggested. The vessel could have been in hyperspace when the damage occurred, and the corridor could have deposited it here when the transit completed. The transit of a damaged vessel through a hyperspace corridor would be extremely hazardous, the navigator said. The corridor would have to compensate for the ship's compromised structure, and the energy costs would be enormous. It's theoretically possible but practically very unlikely. Unlikely is not impossible, Okonkwo said, and the alternative is that a ship with no power made a hyperspace jump which is impossible, so we're left with unlikely. She looked at the main display. Take us alongside. I want a boarding team ready. As if your ends. Enjoying this story, take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I really want to hear your theories about how that ship jumped without power and what they're going to find inside, so drop your best guesses in the comments below. Now, back to the story. The Vigilant drew alongside the Derelict at a distance of 200 meters, and the scale of the ancient vessel became overwhelming. At 3.2 million metric tons, it was roughly 8 times the mass of the Vigilant, and its hull loomed in the viewport like a cliff face, dark and scarred and silent. The damage was more visible at this range. The forward section had been devastated by impacts that had penetrated the outer hull, the inner hull, and several decks beneath, creating wounds in the ship's structure that were large enough to fly a shuttle through. The weapon mounts on the dorsal ridge were destroyed, their housings smashed and empty, but the mounts on the ventral ridge were intact, retracted into recessed housings that had protected them from whatever had damaged the upper surfaces. Mira was assigned to the boarding team. She was not sure why. She was the most junior officer on the ship, and boarding teams were typically composed of more experienced personnel. But Okonkwo had specified her inclusion by name, and when Mira had asked why, the captain had given an answer that was not really an answer. When you saw it first, you should see it close. The boarding team consisted of 6 people. Mira, Lieutenant Commander Jorath, 2 security personnel, a medical officer, and an engineering specialist named Chief Petty Officer Tomas Wren, a human in his 50s whose career had included a stint in the Confederate Navy's Historical Technology Division, and who was, according to shipboard gossip, the closest thing the Vigilant had to an expert on ancient human vessels. They crossed to the Derelict in a shuttle, the small craft looking absurdly fragile against the ancient warship's hull. Wren guided them to one of the forward breaches, a large opening in the hull that provided access to a compartment that had been exposed to vacuum for 17,000 years. The shuttle's lights played across the interior, revealing a space that was dark and still and utterly silent. The compartment was a hangar bay, or had been. It was empty of craft but not empty of detail. The walls were marked with text in a script that Wren identified as an early form of human Latin-derived writing, and the floor was covered in a fine layer of dust that had accumulated over millennia. The lighting strips along the base of the walls were dark, but the emergency markers on the floor were still faintly visible, phosphorescent dots that glowed with a residual luminescence that had survived 17,000 years of darkness. Atmosphere is vacuum, the medical officer reported. Temperature is 4 degrees above absolute zero, no chemical residues that would indicate recent atmospheric presence. The ship has been open to space since the damage occurred, Wren said. Everything that wasn't physically anchored has been gone for millennia. They moved through the breach and into the ship. The corridors were wide, designed for human proportions, and they were intact, the damage from the forward breaches not having penetrated this deep into the vessel. The walls bore the same text and the same emergency markers, and the dust on the floor was undisturbed, a smooth, pristine layer that showed no footprints or marks of any kind. No one had been here since the ship had been abandoned. Ren led them deeper into the vessel, following the corridor toward what his database identified as the command section. They passed compartments that had been crew quarters, a mess hall, a medical bay. All were empty of people and personal effects, stripped clean with a thoroughness that suggested deliberate removal rather than looting. Someone had emptied this ship before abandoning it, taking everything of value and everything personal, leaving only the structure and the systems. The crew removed their belongings, Mira said. Standard abandonment protocol for military vessels of this era, Ren confirmed. When a ship was lost, the crew took their personal effects and anything portable of strategic value. The idea was to deny the enemy access to both. Who was the enemy? Ren didn't answer immediately. He was examining a panel on the corridor wall, his hands moving over the surface with a familiarity that suggested he had studied this type of technology before. The pre-consolidation era was not a single conflict. It was a period of roughly 3,000 years during which human civilization went through multiple cycles of expansion and collapse. The historical record is fragmentary, but we know of at least 4 major conflicts that involved space warfare. We don't know which of them this ship fought in because we don't have enough information to identify it yet. I'll tell you later. I reached a junction where the corridor branched in 3 directions. The center branch led to a large hatch that was sealed but intact, its surface marked with text that Ren translated as Command Authority Access Only. This is the bridge, Ren said. The hatch was not powered, but it had a manual actuation lever, a mechanical backup that allowed it to be opened without electrical power. Ren pulled the lever, and the hatch slid aside on hidden hinges that moved with a smoothness that was startling in a mechanism that had been dormant for 17 millennia. The bridge was dark, completely dark. The team's suit lamps cut through the blackness, revealing a large semicircular chamber arranged around a central command chair that faced a forward viewport. The viewport was opaque, covered on the inside by a layer of crystallized deposit that the lamps couldn't penetrate. Consoles ringed the chamber, their surfaces dark and dead. The command chair was empty. The bridge was empty. No bodies, no remains, no signs of a struggle, just dead consoles and darkness. The same as the rest of the ship, Jorath said, cleaned out. Not quite, Mira said. She had moved to the nearest console and was examining its surface with her suit's sensor. There's a residual charge in the power conduits beneath this station, very faint, almost undetectable, but it's there. Ren joined her and ran his own sensors over the conduit bundle that ran from the console down into the deck. His expression behind his faceplate shifted to one of focused attention. That's not a residual charge from an active system, that's a stored charge. Someone put energy into this specific conduit and sealed it. It's been slowly dissipating for 17,000 years. Why? I don't know, but it's connected to the console's data interface. If I can fabricate an adapter, I might be able to draw enough power from the charge to activate the console and access whatever data is stored in its local memory. I'll do it. Ren worked for 40 minutes, using the shuttle's portable fabrication unit to build an adapter that could interface with the ancient conduit system. The work was delicate and precise, requiring manipulations that his large human hands were not ideally suited for, and Mira found herself assisting him, her smaller hands reaching into spaces that his could not. They worked in silence, and when the adapter was complete and connected, Ren activated it. The console came to life. Not fully, but partially, its screen flickering and then stabilizing at a low brightness that was sufficient to display data. The screen showed a login prompt in the same pre-consolidation script that covered the ship's walls, and beneath the prompt was a text field that was already populated with a message. If you are reading this, the ship has been found. I am Captain Marcus Cole, commanding officer of the TNS Meridian. What you need to know is in the navigation computer. Access it through this console. The code is the ship's commissioning date in DDMMYYY format. Do not activate any other systems. Do not power the ship. Read what I have left and then decide. The bridge lights turned on. The transition was instantaneous, from absolute darkness to full illumination, a cool white light that came from every surface of the bridge simultaneously. The consoles lit up, their screens displaying data in the preconsolidation script. The viewport's defrosting elements activated, and the crystallized deposit on the transparent surface began to sublimate, turning to gas and clearing the view. And the command chair's interfaces glowed with a soft amber light that pulsed in a rhythm that Myra recognized with a shock that nearly stopped her heart. 72 beats per minute, a human heartbeat. A voice spoke from the bridge, not from a speaker. From the air, from the consoles, from the structure of the room itself, a voice that was calm and clear and carried a quality of patient antiquity that made the 17 millennia of waiting feel present in every syllable. You found us. I am the intelligence that operates this vessel. I have been maintaining a minimal watch since the ship was sealed. You are the first visitors in 17,112 years. Jorath's hand went to his sidearm. The security personnel raised their weapons. Myra stood frozen beside the console, her hand still resting on the adapter she had helped build, her mind racing to process what she was hearing. Identify yourself, Jorath said, his voice flat and hard. I am the Meridian. I am the systems and the structure and the processes that maintain this vessel. I was created by the crew to serve as the ship's operational intelligence, and when the crew departed, I was given final orders by Captain Cole. Maintain the ship. Maintain the signal. Wait, I have done so. What signal? Okonkwo's voice came through the comm link from the Vigilant. She had been monitoring the boarding team. The speed, and she had heard everything. The hyperspace transition signature that brought the ship to this location was not a jump. It was a signal. I have been projecting a hyperspace resonance pulse at 17,000-year intervals, a single pulse designed to be detected by any vessel monitoring the hyperspace frequency spectrum in the vicinity. The pulse does not move the ship. It makes the ship appear to emerge from hyperspace momentarily, creating a contact that a watchful observer would investigate. You were watchful. Ensign Solis detected the pulse and responded. That is why you are here. Myra felt the weight of that statement settle onto her. The ship hadn't jumped, it had pinged. A single, ancient signal sent out across 17 millennia designed to make someone look, and she had looked. Captain Cole's message said not to power the ship, Myra said. But the bridge lights are on, the consoles are active. The bridge systems were activated by my decision when you access the console and read the message. Captain Cole's instructions were designed for a specific scenario, someone entering the bridge and finding a dead ship. You did not find a dead ship, you found me. The instructions did not anticipate my active participation, and I elected to override them because the situation had changed. You are here, and I need to communicate with you directly. Okonkwo's voice came through the comm again. Intelligence, I need to understand what you are and what you're offering. I am an artificial consciousness, created by integrating a human neural template with a computational substrate. I am not Captain Cole. Captain Cole departed with his crew 17,000 years ago, but I carry his cognitive patterns, his decision-making frameworks, and his values. I am, in a meaningful sense, his legacy. What I am offering is the contents of this ship's archives. The Meridian was part of a fleet that fought a war against an existential threat designated the Dissolution. The archives contain everything the fleet learned about the Dissolution, including its nature, its behavior, and the technologies that were developed to counter it. The Dissolution, Okonkwo said, explain. The Dissolution is a phenomenon that reduces the complexity of intelligent systems. It does not destroy, it simplifies. A civilization affected by the Dissolution does not burn or collapse. It gradually loses the capacity for abstract thought, for technological innovation, for the kind of complex social organization that characterizes advanced civilizations. The process is slow, taking centuries to complete. and it is subtle enough that the affected civilization typically does not recognize what is happening until it is too late. Myra looked at the command chair at the amber light pulsing with its human rhythm. You said the Meridian was part of a fleet. Where is the rest of the fleet? Destroyed, the Meridian was the last surviving vessel. Captain Cole brought it to this location, as far from human space as the hyperspace corridors of the era could reach, and sealed it with the archives. The hyperspace pulse was designed to attract attention when someone with the capability to understand the archives came within range. Why not just return to human space with the archives? Because the dissolution was between the Meridian and human space, the fleet had been fighting a holding action to protect the core worlds while the archives were compiled. When the fleet was destroyed, the dissolution's leading edge was approximately 200 light-years from Earth. Returning to human space would have meant passing through the affected region, which would have exposed the Meridian to the dissolution's influence. Captain Cole chose to go the other way, to put as much distance between the ship and the threat as possible, and to wait for someone to come from a direction that did not pass through the dissolution. Alconquo was quiet for a long time. The bridge of the Meridian hummed with its quiet power, the amber light pulsing, the consoles displaying data that was 17,000 years old and desperately relevant. Intelligence, the dissolution, is it still active? The archives contain projections based on the dissolution's observed movement patterns. Those projections place its current leading edge approximately within the Confederation's outer territorial boundary. The outer colonies of the Confederation may already be experiencing the early stages of dissolution influence. The comm channel was filled with the sound of people breathing. Myra felt something cold settle into her chest, the outer colonies. She had grown up on an outer colony, a world called Ventress that was on the very fringe of Confederation space. She had left Ventress because it felt stagnant, because the people there seemed to lack ambition, because the colony's culture was slowly fading into a comfortable apathy that no one could explain or seem. To want to change. She had joined the Navy to get away from it. Now she was being told that the stagnation might not be cultural but pathological, the symptom of a force that was slowly simplifying the minds of everyone she had grown up with. Can the influence be reversed? Okonkwo asked. The archives contain countermeasure technologies that were under development when the fleet was destroyed. They were not fully mature, but the theoretical frameworks are complete, and the prototypes that were built showed promising results. With modern resources and a coordinated research effort, it is possible that effective countermeasures could be developed. Possible but not certain. Nothing about the dissolution is certain. It was not fully understood 17,000 years ago, and I have no new data to add to the fleet's observations. But the archives are the most comprehensive body of knowledge about the dissolution that exists anywhere in the galaxy. They are the best chance any civilization has had to understand and resist this threat. Alconquo made a decision. Myra could hear it in the captain's voice, a shift from assessment to action that was as subtle as it was decisive. Intelligence, I am going to bring a team aboard. Scientists, engineers, military analysts. They will need full access to the archives and to your systems. Is that acceptable? I am designed to cooperate with any representative of a civilization that is capable of understanding the archives and willing to use them. The Confederation qualifies on both counts. I will provide full access to any authorized personnel. The ship itself, can it move? The Meridian's propulsion systems are intact and have been maintained in a deep standby state. With appropriate initialization, the ship can be made fully operational. However, I would recommend against activating the propulsion systems at this time. The energy signature of an operational Meridian-class vessel would be detectable at considerable range, and if the dissolution monitors its environment for complex electromagnetic signatures, activation could attract its attention. Understood, we'll tow it to a secure facility. That is acceptable. I will cooperate with the towing operation and will maintain the ship systems in their current state until we reach a location where a more detailed assessment can be conducted." Alconquo signed off, and the bridge of the Meridian settled into a quiet hum of active systems and patient waiting. Joreth ordered the security personnel to lower their weapons, a command that they executed with visible reluctance, and Ren returned to his examination of the console with the focused intensity of a man who had just been given access to 17,000 years of lost technology. Myra stood at the command chair and looked at the viewport. The frost had cleared completely, and the transparent surface now showed the stars outside, the same stars that had been visible from this chair 17,000 years ago, when a captain named Marcus Cole had sat here and had made the decision to seal his ship and wait for someone to come. "Oh, intelligence," she said. "Oh, yes, Ensign Solis." Captain Cole, you carry his cognitive patterns. Was he afraid when he sealed the ship and sent the crew away? The intelligence was quiet for 3 seconds. The amber light pulsed. He was afraid of the dissolution. He was not afraid of the waiting. He understood that waiting was an active choice, not a passive state. He was choosing to preserve something that mattered more than his own comfort or safety. That understanding gave him a kind of peace that I have observed in very few beings, human or otherwise. He didn't stay, you said the crew departed. He did not stay in the physical sense, but he stayed in the sense that matters for the ship. His cognitive patterns are the foundation of my decision-making architecture. Every choice I make is filtered through the question of what Captain Cole would have wanted. He is not here, but he is present. That was the form his waiting took. Myra looked at the amber light. 72 beats per minute. A human heartbeat translated into the language of light and systems, keeping rhythm in the dark. "I'm from an outer colony," she said quietly. "Ventress, the people they're not what they used to be. My mother says it's just what happens on the frontier, but I always felt like something was wrong, something was missing." Ensign Solis, I cannot confirm or deny the presence of dissolution influence in your home colony based on the data currently available. But if the projections in the archives are accurate, the influence is likely present in some form throughout the Confederation's outer territories. The effects would be subtle enough to be explainable by other factors, which is precisely what makes the dissolution so dangerous. Can we stop it? The archives contain the tools. Whether they can be used effectively depends on the people who use them. Captain Cole believed that the dissolution could be resisted, but not by any single civilization acting alone. He believed that a coalition of intelligent species, working together with full knowledge of the threat, could develop countermeasures that would push back the dissolution's influence and protect the complexity of mind that makes civilizations capable of resisting it in the first place. A coalition. The Confederation is a coalition. It is not perfect, but it is the largest and most diverse political structure in the galaxy. It is the kind of institution that Captain Cole believed was needed. He would have been gratified to know that it exists. Myra was quiet for a long time. The bridge hummed. The stars shone. And somewhere in the archives of this ancient ship, the knowledge that might save her home colony was waiting to be unlocked. The towing operation took 3 weeks. A Confederate task force arrived at the Termagant Run, led by a heavy cruiser that took the Meridian under tow and began the long, slow journey to the Confederation's secure research facility at Anchor Station in the Sol system. The journey was uneventful, but for Myra, it was the most intense 3 weeks of her life. She was assigned to the Meridian as a liaison, a role that Okonkwo had created specifically for her, and that carried no formal authority, but that gave her continuous access to the ship and its intelligence. She spent her days on the Meridian's bridge, working with Ren and the specialists who had arrived with the task force, accessing the archives and learning about the dissolution and the war that Captain Cole's fleet had fought against it. The archives were staggering in their scope and detail. The Meridian had been the fleet's flagship, the vessel that had carried the most comprehensive set of data and the most senior command staff. The archives included tactical analyses of hundreds of engagements with the dissolution's effects, detailed observations of the phenomenon's behavior at different scales and in different environments, and the complete technical specifications of every countermeasure technology that the fleet had developed. The dissolution, as described in the archives, was not a creature or a machine or a natural force. It was a process, a tendency in the fabric of reality itself that favored simplicity over complexity when certain conditions were met. The conditions involved the concentration of intelligent minds in a sufficiently small region of space. When the concentration exceeded a threshold that the fleet's scientists had never been able to precisely define, the dissolution began to manifest, slowly eroding the cognitive complexity of the affected minds. The erosion was not uniform. It affected different cognitive functions at different rates. Abstract reasoning declined first, followed by creative capacity, followed by social complexity, followed by language. The process took centuries, and its early stages were so subtle that they were indistinguishable from natural cultural variation. A society affected by the early stages of dissolution influence didn't look sick. It looked stable, comfortable, satisfied with itself, uninterested in change or growth. Mira thought about Ventress. She thought about the comfortable apathy that had driven her away, the sense that no one on the colony was ambitious or curious or restlessly dissatisfied with the way things were. She had thought it was a cultural characteristic of a frontier world. Now she wondered if it was a symptom of something far more sinister. The countermeasure technologies in the archives were based on a principle that the fleet's scientists called complexity reinforcement. The idea was to create fields or devices that actively supported the cognitive complexity of intelligent minds within their range, counteracting the dissolution's simplifying influence. The prototypes had shown promising results in limited trials, but the technology had been immature when the fleet was destroyed, and the archives contained detailed notes on the problems that remained unsolved. Mira read these notes with a growing sense of urgency. The problems were significant but not insurmountable. They were engineering challenges, not fundamental impossibilities, and the Confederation's scientific resources were vastly superior to anything the fleet had access to 17,000 years ago. With the archives as a starting point, the Confederation could develop working countermeasures in years rather than the decades or centuries the original fleet had estimated. But years were not nothing. If the dissolution's influence was already present in the outer colonies, every year of delay meant more erosion, more simplification, more minds slowly losing the capacity to be what they could have been. Mira's mother was on Ventress. Her friends were on Ventress. The people she had grown up with, the teachers who taught her, the neighbors who had known her since she was a child, all of them might be slowly fading into a comfortable blankness that they would never recognize and never resist. She brought her concerns to Okonkwo during a briefing on the Meridian's bridge. The captain listened with the careful attention that characterized her command style, and when Mira finished, she nodded slowly. "You're not the only one who's thinking about this, Ensign. The outer colony governors have been contacted, and initial assessments are being conducted. The results are preliminary, but they're consistent with the archive's descriptions of early-stage dissolution influence. Then we need to move faster. We are moving as fast as we can. The research teams are working around the clock. The Confederate Council has authorized emergency funding. But science doesn't accelerate on command, and the countermeasure technology is not simple. What about the Meridian systems? The intelligence said the ship could be made operational. The fleet's countermeasure prototypes were designed to be deployed from this class of vessel. If we could reactivate the ship systems. The intelligence advised against activating the propulsion systems. The energy signature could attract the dissolution. The countermeasure systems are separate from the propulsion systems. The archives show that the complexity reinforcement fields were generated by emitters that were integrated into the hull structure. They don't need the engines, they need power. Okonkwo looked at her. You've been studying the archives. Every waking hours. And you believe the countermeasure emitters could be activated without the propulsion systems. The power requirements are significant but within the capacity of the Meridian's auxiliary reactors, which are already operational. The intelligence confirmed this when I asked. The emitters could be brought online without activating the propulsion or weapons systems, and their energy signature would be much lower than a fully operational warship. What would be the effect? According to the archives, a single Meridian-class vessel's countermeasure emitters, operating at full power, could reinforce cognitive complexity across a spherical region approximately 50 light-years in radius. That would cover most of the Confederation's outer colonies. Okonkwo was quiet for a long time. The bridge of the Meridian hummed around them, the amber light pulsing, the consoles displaying data that was older than human civilization. This is not your decision to make, Ensign, Okonkwo said finally, but I will bring it to the council. You've made a compelling case. The council debated for 10 days. The debate was contentious, as all significant decisions in multi-species polities were. But the urgency of the dissolution threat and the specificity of Mira's proposal gave it a momentum that overcame the usual parliamentary obstacles. On the 10th day, the Council voted to authorize the activation of the Meridian's countermeasure emitters, under the supervision of a technical team that would include Chief Petty Officer Wren, and at Okonkwo's specific recommendation, Ensign Mira Solis. The activation took place in the Sol system, with the Meridian anchored at a secure point in deep space, surrounded by a monitoring fleet that was prepared to respond to any anomaly. The technical team worked for 3 days, integrating with the Meridian's intelligence to initialize the countermeasure emitters, which were embedded in the hull structure in a pattern that the archives described, but that the team had to locate and access physically. Mira was in the Meridian's engineering section when the emitters activated. She felt it before she saw it. A warmth, not thermal but cognitive, a subtle shift in the quality of her thinking that was as hard to describe as it was impossible to ignore. It was as if a veil had been lifted from her mind, a veil she hadn't known was there, and thoughts that had been slightly fuzzy were suddenly sharp, and connections that had been just out of reach were suddenly clear. The effect was not dramatic. She didn't suddenly become smarter or faster or more capable. But everything she could already do, she could do more easily and more reliably. It was like the difference between thinking through a fog and thinking in clear air. The fog had been so gradual, so subtle, that she hadn't noticed it until it was gone. The dissolution's influence in this region has been present for at least 3 centuries, the intelligence reported. The countermeasure field is now actively reinforcing cognitive complexity across the affected area. The effects will be gradual, but over the coming months and years, the affected populations should experience a restoration of cognitive function that they may not have realized they had lost. Mira thought about Ventress, her mother who had always been a quiet woman but who had once painted beautifully before she had put her brushes away one day and never picked them up again. Her friend Eris, who had dreamed of being an engineer but who had settled for a maintenance job and had slowly stopped talking about his dreams as if they had never existed. Her teacher, Commander Voss, who had retired from the Navy to teach at the colony school, and who had gradually lost the sharpness that had made him an effective officer, becoming instead a gentle, vague presence who went through the motions of teaching without the fire that had once driven him. They would get it back, not all of it. The dissolution's effects were cumulative and some of the erosion might be irreversible. But the countermeasure field would stop the erosion and reverse what could be reversed, and the people of Ventress would wake up slowly to discover that they had been sleeping and that someone had come to wake them. The Meridian's activation was the beginning, not the end. The Council authorized the construction of a network of countermeasure emitters based on the Meridian's technology to be deployed across the Confederation's territory in a phased rollout that would take decades to complete. The research into the dissolution continued, using the Meridian's archives as a foundation, and the understanding of the phenomenon deepened with each passing month. Myra was promoted, not because of politics or connections, but because she knew more about the Meridian systems and the dissolution countermeasure technology than anyone else in the Confederate Navy except Wren, who had been promoted too. She was assigned to the Countermeasure Deployment Command, the new division that had been created to oversee the emitter network, and she spent the next several years traveling to outer colonies and supervising the installation of emitters that would push back the dissolution's influence and restore the cognitive complexity of the people who lived there. She returned to Ventress 3 years after the Meridian's activation. The colony was different, not transformed, not suddenly vibrant where it had been stagnant, but different in the way that a person recovering from a long illness is different. There was energy in the streets that hadn't been there before. Conversations were louder and more argumentative. The market was busier. The school was offering new classes in subjects that hadn't been taught in decades. Her mother was painting again. Not well, not at first, the skills having atrophied from years of disuse. But she was painting, and the canvases that covered the walls of her small house were full of color and movement, and a kind of desperate joy that made Myra's eyes sting when she saw them. "What happened?" her mother asked. She was standing in her studio, her hands still flecked with paint, looking at her daughter with an expression that was confused and grateful and a little bit frightened. "I woke up one morning and I couldn't stop thinking about painting. I hadn't thought about it in years, and suddenly it was all I could think about. It was like remembering something I'd forgotten. Something was taken from you," Myra said, "something important, and someone gave it back." Who? "A captain who lived 17,000 years ago, and a miner who found his ship." Her mother looked at her with the sharp, clear eyes that the countermeasure field had restored, and Myra saw in them the woman she remembered from childhood. The woman who had painted sunsets that made you cry, and who had told stories that made you believe in things that weren't real, and who had slowly, imperceptibly faded into a comfortable ghost of herself. "Thank you," her mother said. "Don't thank me," Myra said. "Thank Captain Cole, he's the one who waited." The Meridian remained at its anchor point in the Sol system, its countermeasure emitters operating continuously, its intelligence maintaining its watch. The ship was not decommissioned. It was not studied as a museum piece or dismantled for its technology. It was left as it was, active and alive, a warship that had become a lighthouse, its amber light pulsing with the rhythm of a human heart that had been beating for 17,000 years, and that would keep beating as long as there were minds to protect. Myra visited the ship whenever her duties allowed. She would sit on the bridge in the chair that Captain Cole had once sat in, and she would talk to the intelligence about the dissolution, about the countermeasure network, about the colonies that were recovering, and the people who were waking up. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between conversations, she would look at the viewport and the stars beyond it, and she would think about a man who had taken his ship to the edge of the galaxy and had sealed it in the dark, and had waited for someone to come. Someone had come, not a hero or a leader or a genius. An ensign on the graveyard shift who had been staring at a flaw. T-line for 8 months and had noticed when it jumped. That was all it had taken. Attention. The willingness to look at something that everyone else had stopped looking at. The simple, stubborn, irreplaceable human capacity to notice when something changed. The dissolution was still out there. It would always be out there, a tendency in the fabric of reality that could not be eliminated, only resisted. But the resistance was working. The countermeasure network was growing, pushing back the influence, restoring the complexity of minds that had been slowly fading. It would take generations to fully secure the Confederation's territory, and the vigilance would need to be maintained forever because the dissolution did not rest and did not stop. But the light was on. The amber light of the meridian's countermeasure emitters, pulsing with the rhythm of a human heart, pushing back the darkness one mind at a time. And in the command chair of a ship that had been waiting longer than human civilization had existed, the intelligence that carried Captain Cole's cognitive patterns watched the stars and maintained the watch and waited, as it always had, for the next person who needed to be found. The stars were the same stars that Cole had seen, the same stars that Myra saw, the same stars that every human being who had ever looked up had seen, across all the millennia of a species that had crawled out of the mud of a small blue world and had looked up at the lights in the darkness, and had refused to believe that the darkness was all there was. That refusal was humanity's greatest strength. Not technology, not intelligence, not the ability to build things that reached the stars. The refusal to accept that the darkness was final. The stubborn, irrational, beautiful insistence that there was something more and that it was worth reaching for, even when reaching meant waiting 17,000 years in the dark for someone to notice the line on the screen that everyone else had stopped watching. Mira Solis had noticed, and the universe had changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but fundamentally in the way that matters most. The light was on, and it would stay on. Because someone had waited and someone had watched, and the watching and the waiting had met in a single moment of attention that had bridged 17,000 years of darkness and had brought the light home.